Hello and welcome to the podcast. We're recording this in 5th of June, 2024. I'm here with John Mixon as always. How are you, John?
I'm very good, Dan. It's so funny. We were just talking. Our guest sent us the book that we're going to talk about, and also his organization. It's called In the Small Places: Stories of Teacher Changemakers and the Power of Human Agency. And Dan and I were just bemoaning the postal system in the Czech Republic, how I actually had sent him a box and it got shipped back. I sent a box to a friend for her 60th. It got back, and the book, Dan, right, is stuck in
It's just,
customs.
yeah, I mean, it's the EU policy. It's just a nightmare. I mean, it used to, small things used to just get through all the time, but now nothing comes through. You got to pay duty and everything. It's a nightmare.
That's interesting because it's a British publishing company.
Yeah, well, that's sending from the UK to here is the same. It's just not in the EU now. So that's the problem.
Anyway, so if you're mailing stuff, put no value and put it in a little box or something. Yeah. That's the secret. Anyway, it's nice to be here. And I know we'll be listening to this in August, but we just had a chance to connect with Fred, who's the founder of Teacher Without Borders. And we were approached by, I think, your publisher, and Dan and I thought, oh, this would be really very interesting because we so often focus on international schools. And what, Fred, you're doing is very different. This is about education in places that most international school teachers would never dream of teaching or maybe working. And I think it's really important for us also to highlight some of the phenomenal work that your organization is doing and kind of elevate some of this work. So, Fred, if you don't, a warm welcome to International School Podcasts. Thank you again for shipping the books. And maybe you can just quickly introduce yourself, and then we'll kick off with a conversation.
Sure. I'm Fred Mednick. I founded Teachers Without Borders in the year 2000. And I just finished and am now a professor emeritus at a Belgian university, the Vrije Universiteit Brussels, in teaching courses on education and global change. So Teachers Without Borders has been around for now 24 years. Can't believe it. Wow. And we'll talk about, what we've done and what our challenges are and, what we see in the future.
So, Fred, tell me, why Teachers Without Borders? What kind of inspired you? Because you're in education, you have a history in higher education. What suddenly one day you woke up and said, okay, we're doing this?
Yeah. Well, before this, I was a high school principal and a teacher, and I was going back to get my doctorate because I had written another book on adolescence, which was, I titled it Rebel Without a Car. And it was the experience of, being a principal and seeing adolescents sort of in their natural habitat. And my dissertation, or at least I thought, I wanted to find out about what the educated teenager for the 21st century needs and is like. And the internet was coming in, and I come from an international family. And so I just put a question out there in the ether, what do you see outside your window? Which is a silly question for a doctoral committee because they said, like, where's the data here? What are you doing? But I was very chatty, and people were responding all over the world. I got access to teachers, and they said, I see this, I worry about this, I worry about that. And then on one day, there was this woman in Nicaragua who's just, frustrated by the heat and the bars on her classroom windows, and said she just wanted to go someplace and see snow and make a snow angel. And an hour later, unconnected, because I hadn't really connected teachers, this woman from Norway called and said, it's just another storm coming in. I want to go to someplace sunny. And so I decided to connect the two. And what happened was this reciprocity and goodwill and sharing of ideas. And it just sparked the idea of, given the fact that it's a new millennium, I live in Seattle, and the battle of Seattle over globalism is going on. Doctors Without Borders had received, the Nobel Prize I had always had this international spirit. I said, well, what if I connected these teachers to make change in their own communities, not sending people all over the world to make change, but, recognizing the inherent wisdom and brains evenly distributed in the local communities, and connect them. And so I fired myself from my really good job. I loved the place, and just, leapt out into the unknown.
Amazing. So you just decided, okay, I'm going to quit this job. I have a cushy job and I'm going to try to do this. Did you have some funding or you just went on a whim?
No, I had no funding. My wife, psychologist and an art therapist, and she said, "I don't think I'm going to stop you. This is going to be a very long, extended manic episode, I think." Um, it's interesting that lots of people say I need money in order to do something.
Hmm.
And I always approach this, I need community and brains in order to do something. And then people will recognize it. And then, fund, scale, and replication. So the projects were without funding, but the sort of goodwill and drive of partnerships and sharing. So really emphasizing the role that teachers are the largest professionally trained group in the world. I mean, they know who's sick or missing or orphaned by disasters. They put the polio drops in, they have their ear to the ground. They're the world's acupuncture points. And so why not connect them rather than necessarily just wait for top-down change?
Fred, I
I
think really interesting point you made. It's just a bigger point than just education about, you know, not waiting for money, just doing things anywhere because you don't need money. I mean, it's interesting. I've started 3 businesses all with zero money, and I think it's a great lesson to learn. I think I talk to people all the time who want to start a new venture, whether it's a nonprofit or a business, and they say, "Oh, I need to get funding. How do I fundraise?" And that's the wrong way to look at it. From my opinion, is just get started. When something's in motion, it comes along, and I think it's great. I mean, I think I'm quite fortunate that when I was in my 20s, I was very poor and I traveled around and I realized that, and I did some volunteering, and I had an amazing time. And I realized that actually, I lost that connection between being rich and doing good things and enjoying it. So I think just a general philosophical point. I think that's a really good point you made.
Thanks.
Yeah, and I love the idea that both you and Dan are highlighting is that you got the passion, you've got the idea, and then you mentioned the community and the partnerships. It kind of almost self-propagates itself. And Dan, it sounds like you were volunteering, you had no money, and then somehow you kept going, you kept
Yeah,
traveling,
exactly.
and
Yeah.
things fell into your lap. So I think one thing that maybe we can get into a bit of nitty-gritty. So Teachers Without Borders, I mean, there's Doctors Without Borders, which you mentioned. Tell us exactly what that looks like. So if I want to sign up or I want to find out, Fred, and then we'll go more into philosophy and
Sure.
the history in the book, but
Yeah.
give the audience kind of a breakdown. What does this mean and how do people get involved?
Sure. Well, it's important to know that everything in the organization is a no strings attached free thing. And so somebody who might be interested in joining Teachers Without Borders shouldn't expect that this is like edu tours or travel. They join because they have an idea, and they have valuable information to share. And I can come back to that phrase a little bit later. And it's been people of all ages. I've had, in fact, the project, fairly significant project, started with the idea of a 16-year-old who wanted to be a teacher. One in Afghanistan who said his sister is depressed and can't go to school, and what could he do? So these are teachers with a kind of, or even the non-formal sector, who have a passion. Now we have a set of themes: education in emergencies, and then we could talk about that. Girls' education, peace and human rights. Basically, the 3 areas that are aligned with the UN goals. And people who have that interest and who see themselves in there, um, just join the network, start conversations, learn about projects that they themselves have designed based upon the resources and courses and conversations we have. And then I start to connect them, and other people connect them to the resources and tools that they need to make the kinds of change they would like. And so many things have happened. In fact, that every single program in the organization is conceived by and led by teachers in mostly developing countries. So, that really that notion of brains, not only that brains are evenly distributed, but that we don't pander to them and patronize them and broadcast stuff from, the West to the East to enlighten the rest. It's really a collective enterprise. And one thing that came very clear very early is that, just as this is an education thing, we always have that debate about whether teachers are born or made. Teacher leaders are born or made. I kind of reject the whole notion and say they show up, you know, and they have shown up in times of great distress. But when something happens in the world, I will first go to the teachers who are part of the Teachers Without Borders network and connect with them and find out what's outside their window and what the real in the ground on the ground report is like. So it's very, very grassroots in that particular way.
That was a quote by Woody Allen: 90% of success in life is just showing up.
Yeah,
Right.
I love that. I love that. And so what's interesting is that you kind of highlighted that a lot of it is ground up. So there are teachers in places that maybe are less advantaged or might be even in a war zone or a place that's recovering from a war zone. And you have teachers that reach out and say, I want now all my kids to be able, I don't know, to have access to a computer. I'm just throwing something out. And then this is where the traction comes, and then they connect with you, and then you'll make the connections. Maybe there's a more wealthy school that has an upgrade of computers, and then we can ship those computers to the school that doesn't. Is that a bit of an example, or am I off?
Yeah, that's a very good example. Generally, there's such an evolution in the whole computer stuff, because for years and years we used to ship computers around and write grants for this. Now, there's an article in the New York Times about communities in, remote Amazon areas that are, using WhatsApp. So, that whole evolution has changed. But yes, it's a spark of a leader with the kind of street cred to be able to have that kind of credibility. But also over time, we've learned that, you can live in this bottom up change world, but that it can so easily be undermined by the top. And so the true leader is able to sit in the village that she or he, comes from, but able to hold, her or his own at, levels of the Minister of Education, that it has to be horizontal and vertical, and that, the skills we find are in developing the leader's capacity to navigate those spaces. And that's been a change. It started out with, it's all bottom up. Well, as we know that a school head can undermine the school culture, so too in various levels of, community life, the ones that have the position leadership could often undermine, the best efforts. So we have to play that game.
So one thing you highlighted and mentioned was the street cred and being a leader, and that, what have you noticed? Because, for many of our audiences, we're in international schools, we're super well resourced. We have, very good packages of home leave, housing, and et cetera. I keep going. It's quite phenomenal. It's quite amazing. Okay. Different international school teachers have different opinions how great it is, but I think in comparison, it's pretty amazing. What is it about the people that you have noticed over your 24 years that have got that leadership edge where they're maybe willing to step out in a place that has a lot of things, that are challenging, and maybe they themselves have a lot of things going against them? What is kind of the disposition? What have you noticed? This is going to work because of?
Sure. There's a certain sense, and I think, you get stamped with this irrepressible, nothing is going to stop me, unflappable sense of mission, that that transcends even your most difficult circumstances. So the stories I tell in the book are about particular people who live in the context of great deprivation, largely, and who see themselves, I am who I am because of other people, to use a kind of Ubuntu phrase. They are, they see themselves as a part of everything else, not necessarily in some kind of sort of bourgeois altruism, um, but a sense that they know that life can be made better only when a community can mobilize its own resources. So each story is, whether it's in Pakistan or Afghanistan or Rwanda or Nigeria, these are all people who live it and breathe it, and for some reason have both the vision to and impatience and unflappability to be able to say, this doesn't meet the standard of human dignity.
And so how do that's the leadership component, but you talked about street cred. What is it about them, man or woman, that suddenly generates a group of people to say, wow, that's a good idea. I want to follow them. I want to dedicate time. Because in your stories, it's very much about community. You talk about this idea that it doesn't work if you're by yourself. Your community has to come up together. And actually, the community is coming together. And even though there are hierarchies that might be against it or situations against it, the community realizes the only way they'll be successful is if they stick together and all buy into this vision. But somebody is the leader. They have that street cred. What does
Yeah.
street cred look like in those contexts?
Well, in many ways, it's there's also they're trusted. The human dimension. I remember being at this very fancy conference where everyone was in a circle talking about their theory of international development, and I mean, I had all the academic credentials, but I'm thinking, do I have a theory of development? Do I have a universal comprehensive strategy and checklist? And it came to my turn, and I said to myself, oh, screw it, I'm going to say what I really think. And I said, make friends. And though that sounds so naive and stupid, it's what I've learned is this deep sense of trust that comes when the local leader is sincere, and takes the actions, that and often does things for others when no one's looking. There's a certain moral presence about them, and also just the life experience. I mean, some have been traumatized, don't want to wish that on anyone, their family, anybody else, but they see somehow that there can be a better way. And each story, to me, I wanted to honor that kind of profile of person.
And that profile of a person is what I really, and we'll, in the show notes for our audience, in the small places, you kind of highlight these people. That's what's so rich about this book, is these kind of narratives around these stories, just bring them to life. Now, you had talked previously, you do girls' education, emergency, and peace. And I want to make sure that and human rights education. Talk a bit about emergency education, because if I look at my newspaper today, there are quite a few emergencies out there. And I'm just wondering, how do you position yourself to be able to support people where there's say, a war zone, if we can go there?
Well, let's look at, I mean, I don't want to be all professorial here, but when you look at this sort of field of emergency education, people should think of it this way, that there's this prevention and planning phase, right, where people learn about, the potential. Let's say, the climate change issues is a good example. Preparation and planning. Then there's the intervention in the crisis, the setting up, for instance, of child-friendly spaces in the midst of a disaster, where teachers are employed to count the kids, reunite the families, reestablish a certain sense of normalcy, and create a context for other aid workers to do their work. And then there's the reconstruction element of, education in emergencies. So we have often been in all three of those phases, but let's just go right into the heart of, the emergency itself, the intervention state. So let's say the Pakistan floods, have really ravaged the country. Sometimes up to 40% of the country is underwater. So I work with, let's say this one person, Samina, I'll talk about her and her organization, the Podahar Organization for Development Assistance, PODA, PODA.PK is her website. And they've always been, very, very close with Teachers Without Borders. So she lives in a village. She does girls' education, but her village responded to the floods and the earthquake by establishing these child-friendly spaces and then making partnerships with UNICEF or others. So it's not as if Teachers Without Borders descends upon a place, it says we're here. It's one of the better connectors on the ground. And Samina and Poda work towards, creating a context for supplies and education to continue in spite of the emergency, and to the point where it's about 15 years ago, finally teachers are included in first responding teams, responder teams. It used to be that you would think of some kind of sort of hierarchy of aid that normally people would, immediately say, well, you got to feed them, you got to house them. And like some kind of Maslow hierarchy here. And what people clearly saw, that kids get trafficked right off the bat, that families are reunited. They can't even understand about aid unless, there's certain conditions for their family. So that a person who is part of an education in emergency team, whether it's run by Save the Children, United Nations, always now by policy and requirement include teachers in the community and teachers who are supporting that, because they realize, they're the key to understanding the crisis from the perspective of the smallest unit really is the family. And the most compelling by far experiences I've had, with Teachers Without Borders have been in that kind of context of education in emergencies, when something happens. Certainly, it's very difficult now. We cannot yet get anything together, in Gaza, for instance. There was, and in some parts of Sudan, but there are but we're working on it and got some leads, on that. And sometimes it has to do with refugees who have those skills. Remember, people used to think refugees, the great unwashed leaving their communities, and we have to serve them, when there are doctors and lawyers and teachers who have those brains, who sometimes get ignored, but conversely are the key, to development and change and stability. So lots of stories about that.
It's interesting that you highlight as something that we forget is that, refugees, that they're from all walks of life. It's not always the poor. I mean, in Gaza and Sudan and the Ukraine, we're seeing people of all walks of life. And I think it's interesting that you say, teachers are also impacted about that. But I think something that I did not know, and I don't know about you, Dan, I didn't realize that emergency organizations now make it a policy to make sure there are educators there. What suddenly did they realize, oh, we need educators? How did that come about? Because that wasn't too long ago.
Well, it came about, if I remember correctly, I have to check, in and around the earthquake in China, 2008 or so, when the notion of looking at the metrics of progress, part of it is reuniting a family. Part of it is whether the kids are trafficked, and this would fall through the cracks in the whole context of food, water, food security, shelter, housing, and in fact, what ended up happening is there's a very wonderful organization called the International Network for Education in Emergencies, which does this work beautifully. I'm always a big fan of theirs, and they campaigned with the UN agencies, and made the case that so much can be changed. Now, people will say you can't have kids go to school in the middle of this crisis, when in fact there's enormous ways, different ways in which kids can get educated in places where the crisis has happened, and there's a couple of things going on in places that I would compromise people if I described it too much in detail. But again, teachers, leaders aren't born or made, they show up. And so somebody gets in touch with us in some ways and says, here's the passion, here's what I'm doing. And you realize they don't need resources as much as they need friends. To just go back to that, they need colleagues. So the notion of a network, even an international network with expertise, can help support somebody on the ground to do these kinds of things. And so when the statistics were coming out, they realized it was the educators, the teachers, those acupuncture points, as I said, who were making significant change, who already had the kind of credibility. You remember that aid workers may sometimes descend upon a place, but if there's a familiar face who speaks the language, so much more, can happen.
It is so interesting. And also, I'm wondering when you were saying, having friends, when you do that, so you are actually becoming a connector more than anything. And I'm just thinking of Dan and I, we have our professional learning network and we both leverage it. When I don't understand something, I reach out to people. I'm always on LinkedIn because that's where my professional learning network, I learn, I find things out. So in some ways you're doing the same, but through your organization and making those connections. Is it just literally putting two people's name together, or is it more than that, like doing a virtual introduction, or how does that connection develop?
Right. It happens in a million different ways, but it's also important that people realize that there are these long-standing relationships people have built up over the years, and that, for instance, they've built courses, they've built resources. So there are things we find out about where people sort of key into the sort of name of Teachers Without Borders. Some people expect, I can travel and dispense wisdom, but a lot of people key into the notion that an international perspective, might really support this. So a lot of it is hand done. A lot of it is community kind of getting the notion through things that people have written and we've published on the site. And so there's a course on education in emergencies that was, a self-guided course that we've worked with the International Network for Education in Emergencies, and vetted things where they just take it and use that information, and so we find out about things happening all the time. It's very important that the organization not be seen as a hierarchy, but not be a mess. So there has to it's a delicate balance that we screw up and we do well, for the past quarter decade, where sometimes, it gets out of one's hands. But I have to say, we've never been abused or ripped off, or, some weird things have happened, but it's mostly this notion that we ourselves have the moral integrity and honesty, and people don't feel that there's some kind of quid pro quo here, or that this is a freemium service, that will, ding them later. And it takes a lot of time for that. So it's interesting. Sometimes it just feels like I want to be a part of you guys because I believe in you, and nothing happens, which is fine. Others is I want to be a part of you. I want to learn from you. And others is I want to be a part of you. I want to do something. I want to then contribute it back, to the whole. And these are the ones where we spend our time. So they make themselves known exactly in many ways. Doing what I did was they start their projects. Here's what I understand. Here's what we're doing.
Yeah.
And so, it should take on that flavor.
That's and I like the idea that they're already in motion with a project. It's not like they're coming, well, I have an idea, I haven't really thought it through, could you help me? I'm hearing more, it's like I'm in motion, the project is on the ground, I'm starting to build community, and I'm reaching out because I could use some connections, I could amplify that. How can I enhance it?
Right. And I think that your listeners would sort of benefit if you don't mind, if I could tell one story of one.
Yeah.
So Teachers Without Borders had been working with us, teachers in China, in Duzhenyan, China, in Sichuan province, because they really wanted to learn how to do science inquiry, teaching. And they were doing this because they really wanted kids to be aware of, the community around them. And these Chinese teachers were, leading this. And there was a grant at that time for a few of us to go and support them in real time. And we did this for 3 years. And but it was 99% Chinese led. And then I'm back home after, the project, and I'm driving, to work, and I hear there's been an earthquake in China. I hear there's an earthquake in Sichuan, and the more and more, it turns out that it's the earthquake in Duzhenyan. And it's hard to tell the story. We lost the teachers, we lost students, we lost the buildings, and I didn't know what to do. It was just awful, and I was really perseverating watching the videos. Because we had done some, classic international development relief, filled trucks full of stuff, and when there's a crisis, it's always after the fact, and there was always some preventative stuff, but here was devastated the very community that we had been working in. And I did some efforts, but 2 weeks went by. I couldn't stand it. I was back in Sichuan. They're still pulling people out of buildings, and the minister or the director of education for the province said, "You were doing science inquiry. Could you do earthquake science and safety?" This particular guy had been advocating for, safe buildings, but schools were fourth level construction in China then, and 50% of the kids who die in earthquakes around the world die in their schools. We expect the school to be the safest building around. Not so. Tourist hotel or a government building, those get all of this. So we talked about earthquake science and safety. I went to the network, desperate, found this woman, Solmaz Mohajir, has a great TED talk, by the way, called Defeating Earthquakes, or How to Disarm Earthquakes. And she had an earthquake science and safety program. Why? Because she grew up in Iran with earthquakes, went to bed with wearing her shoes because she needed to get out, ends up getting her PhD, and she's a seismologist, and developed this program of earthquake science and safety in a community in Tajikistan who thought that there was a bull, believed there's a bull underneath the earth, and bothered by mosquitoes, it shakes, and that's how earthquakes happen. Buildings collapse. They think, it's God's work, whatever. And she never trashed them or these ideas. She worked slowly with them. She knew the language. And they did these science, they learned all about earthquakes and became advocates for safer buildings. Well, Soma said, yeah, let's figure out how to do this. In China, immediately teachers were volunteered to translate. Teachers, scientists got in touch with, the United States Geological Survey and other science agencies. The INEE, the International Network for Education in Emergencies, got involved, and we developed this program. And this program, by the way, Solmaz developed, is in 7 languages. It's been around the world. The White House, acknowledged it. It's free. And now kids in China, have earthquake science and safety. The textbooks in Tajikistan have some information about earthquake science and safety. And it's customized for the region because some earthquakes are shallow, some are deep. You have to know what the context is, but it was a culturally sound, scientifically credible teacher leader, who was employed to do this. It wasn't that we took all this information and we just spewed it out again. It was
That's
very
fantastic.
hands-on. And the program is, if people look up Teachers Without Borders and earthquake science and safety, you'll see how far this has gone. It's one teacher, great program, mobilizing communities and building a global conversation on keeping communities safe.
It's so interesting that you bring up this story, and then also the kind of the longevity and the depth and how the sustainability of the project multiplied in different contexts. And I just think, as international schools, we do a lot of what I call community action service. You might be familiar with it, but it
Great.
always feels so kind of like we jump in and we leave, and,
Right.
and there's nothing permanent. And I just really appreciate the depth and thought, and also the cultural sensitivity that this story highlights. And I think as international schools, we could really learn sometimes from that, because I think our hearts are in the right place. So the intent is good, but I'm not sure how the impact always sits. And I think this is just a wonderful anecdote that you're bringing forward. And I just think it's an important message for all of us as educators and international school educators to reflect upon, about the dynamics of what actually happened and how it's still now there and it's gone to other places.
Right.
Thank you for sharing that.
Sure. I have to say just one thing. In the beginning of our conversation, I brought up this whole notion of, valuable information and sharing it. And, so the first day of Teachers Without Borders, I decided I'd sort of launch this by going to this conference where there were UN representatives and other international development people. And I don't know where I got the sort of courage to ask, but I asked a UN big shot. I said, could you define a teacher? What is a teacher to you? And the guy looked at me and said, a teacher is anyone with valuable information to share. And I thought, okay, at first sounds a little anemic. But then I thought about this. Anyone, now, we are all professionally trained teachers. I don't want to say that, anyone can be a teacher and just do it and all that. But there are people who are excluded from this sort of moniker of being a teacher. That is the village elder, the person with skills here and there that has valuable information, not, BS stuff or fake news stuff, valuable, verifiable information, and then shares it. And so there are two stories in the book about a forklift driver, and a taxi cab driver.
Oh, yeah.
And who have such value to share. And so I was looking forward to our conversation because here are the international schools with an extraordinary amount of knowledge to share, officially trained teachers. And I was looking forward to it because, I want the international schools to kind of get that sense that it's not just that they're you might portray them as living in their insulated bubble. Anyone with teachers who are working with all the resources should share along with teachers who have great knowledge with no resources. And it's not about giving to poor teachers. It's just about sharing information. If they know, something that other teachers need, they are welcome like anybody, regardless. And so, to exclude or to, sort of put the international schools as a kind of shining example of privilege would, I think, undermine, the great expertise that they have. And I've always loved the international schools, the international baccalaureate program, all of the stuff that you guys have been doing. I thought it's just been spectacular.
Fred, have you actually had any cooperation with any international
I
schools?
haven't really, I've spent my time so much in a lot of the, trenches. But I've given talks, once in a while to them, but I would love, that whole wonderful, big, broad global network, to feel acknowledged and to make contributions and to feel counted. And, the future of Teachers Without Borders is, we're having lots of conversations about, look, the technology caught up. The idea of a network of teachers is something that was new when we were starting. We were all part of the open courseware development with, the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation and UNESCO. Things have changed. And so, I think the network should be a kind of selfless, ad hoc, fluid thing rather than necessarily building a separate empire, of networks. So, someday, I want networks to be fluid and to talk with each other because, after all, these are networks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think something that you brought up is really important is that sometimes when we are in a privileged space or in a privileged position and we give, we feel that there doesn't need to be any return, or we don't expect a return, or because we don't expect it, our ears are maybe not as open to hearing that return. Because we assume, and sometimes we make these assumptions, that if somebody is in a very challenging environment and a teacher, they won't have the wisdom or the experience or the knowledge. And I really like that you talked about that should be a balanced approach where they give as much as you take and you give as much as you take from them. And I think sometimes we forget how important that is, to make sure when we're engaging with different communities, less fortunate to us, that also understand they have a huge richness that they can give to us and perspectives. And I think sometimes we just jump to the conclusion, or in our over enthusiasm to give, we drown them with giving, and they're like, well, actually, I don't need all that stuff. I would just like to talk to you. And guess what? I tried that, and I would love to hear what you think.
And after a while, you'd be surprised because the sort of, let's say class, race, or hierarchies tend to kind of bleed away. There's no one I've talked to in developing countries that resents things coming from the developed world. They want to learn. They have also blown my mind with not only the cultural, astuteness, but the ability to solve problems from a different perspective that I no longer, look for answers from particular places. I look to the network, and it's comprised of people, with wealth and resources, and it's comprised of people with nothing. And there are certain lessons that they offer that are sort of, 101, but we don't think so, because we think, you need money, you need approval from above. And so there are strategies and creative ways in which they solve problems that are amazingly illustrative, um, precisely because they face these obstacles and overcome them. So
A
it would
bit
be
like your
silly
fork,
to hierarchy,
yeah,
to separate. Yeah.
bit like your forklift driver.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just valuable information to share. Now, some teachers will say, well, hey, your forklift driver now is called a teacher, and I went to school forever. I mean, that's really not the point. The point is where the office worker or anyone who can make a contribution and teach others, expands that definition. It doesn't say that all of us, with me, with all my, degrees, doesn't, I don't feel demeaned. I don't feel like anyone's trashing my profession.
Yeah.
If the forklift driver has a perspective, or if the taxi cab driver has that. And so we have to sort of get off of this sort of classist notion, that
Great
information
point.
is one-sided.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, one thing that you mentioned very early on is about this Afghan teenager that was noticing that his sister was not doing well because she couldn't go to school. And girls in education is another component of yours. And maybe just briefly talk about that, because I feel we've talked a bit about emergencies and
Yeah.
the humane, but highlight a bit the girls in education and what are the pinch points? What are you seeing? Where are things really happening?
Yeah. Well, there used to be a phrase that I still love, in international development, um, which is go women, go water, go local. And so the idea of the leaders in the communities are often women, at least in the organization, the projects we work with. And so uh, if you educate girls, as you probably know, everything gets better. I mean, in infant mortality, family income, all those kinds of things. And certainly, Malala's role, in promoting this. But it's all about the power of women's networks. So one of the largest NGOs in the world is BRAC, the Bangladesh Rural Advancement Committee, and it was a women's union. And so if you're educating girls as a sort of primary, effort in one's community, lots of things begin to kick in: public health, public policy. Um, and so in the girls' education, it's often a question of recruiting girls, keeping them in school, hygiene issues at the school, girls, who are sent away, abuse. And so the projects that have taken place have been really led by women to support girls' education. The case in Afghanistan is particularly troubling, and we're doing lots of work with teachers in Afghanistan, and especially school principals. But it's been quite some time since the girls have been able to go back to school. And, however much, we have political points of view about, let's say, the American presence in Afghanistan, or all the people who've used that country as a doormat. The, you know, there was a period between Talibans when girls were beginning to get educated, and so now there's a situation where everybody has to be quite delicate, because you don't want to make the girls that much more vulnerable if they're participating in schools. So there's lots of different kinds of secret schools out there, and the use of women's networks to add education and maintain the spirit of young women, in a place that's so unbelievably repressive. And if I were to do, really, for me, education in emergencies is pretty powerful. If you want to advance an education system from the highest level to basic literacy, I think NGOs need to pool their resources and focus entirely on the education of girls.
And you talk about these secret schools. So these are schools that are basically kept secret, and people agree that they're not going to talk about them, and they're in locations that are on nobody's radar. That's a pretty high stake, risky business, isn't it?
Yeah, there's that, and there's a lot of encrypted networks that even if a phone is confiscated, there's it's very high risk. And believe me, when we were doing earthquake science and safety, and we created a girls' earthquake science and safety program. We worried and talked directly with the State Department about the whole idea of exposing girls, to danger, because they are advocating for change, and how to. So you simultaneously want to educate people, but education is a powerful force within a repressive place. How do you navigate that space so that you've not just made things much worse because of your idealism to get something done there? And look, international development is rife with roads to hell paved with good intentions. And so there's story after story of interventions that make problems worse. And so the acute intelligence and creativity and wherewithal on the ground is absolutely essential for girls' education to flourish without taking two steps back.
And it's interesting that you highlight how the power of the local knowledge, the power of the local community, and the power of the local resilience is really something that sometimes supersedes what an organization that brings in a helicopter and drops a bunch of boxes and maybe a couple aid workers, that is out of context. And I think it's just amazing to hear that here are a group of girls educating themselves on their own in secret, and encrypting their phones. I mean, this is just phenomenal.
Well, it's also, to defy some stereotypes, I'll go back to PODA, that organization, that PODA organization. This is an organization in a village about an hour and a half south of Islamabad in Pakistan. And we all have our beliefs and stereotypes that it's, an incredibly repressive, male-dominated, society. If you go to this village, you will see men playing a supportive role to women leaders. Without they're macho, whatever. There's no sense here of male ego, or they found a way within the culture and within the understanding of Islam to connect Islam and development, men and women working together for peace, for education, for livelihoods, for human rights. And it's sort of led by women, and with men as supporters. And this is not inconceivable. This is not impossible. It can be done because there's this credibility, because all the families realize that their life is better because of this action. And so an organization like PODA not only defies the stereotypes, but gets things done, and has such credibility that the government doesn't mess with them.
How interesting. Love that. Love that. Well, Fred, this has just been a wonderful journey, and thank you for sharing these very rich stories, poignant. I mean, it just makes us reflect, when we sit wherever we're sitting, listening to this podcast, how fortunate we are, what we have and what we get, and also as educators, our situations. I would just love you maybe to share a message to school leaders and then to educators. I just want to remind them in small places, stories of teachers, change makers, and the power of human agency. And actually, Dr. Jane Goodall says, Teacher Without Borders gives me hope. And having actually done some work with Jane Goodall in Tanzania many, many years ago and spent time with her, that's quite the poignant recommendation. And so I really encourage you to look at the book. It's available at any of your bookstores. And Fred, as we wrap up, I don't know, Dan, is there anything you want to ask before we ask Fred to
No,
conclude?
I've really enjoyed it. It's been a learning experience for me. So thanks, Fred.
Fred, go ahead. Two
Yeah, sure.
messages.
Well, a message to teacher leaders is that, I've always been told that teachers don't put anything more on teachers' plates. They've got enough to do. They're tyrannized by the urgent. And I clearly understand that. But at the same time, I kind of find that a bit demeaning. People get into the profession in order to be of service. And so the people who are the leaders here are not as concerned that much with the tyranny of the urgent. They're concerned about the urgency of tyranny. And they take, the ball in their own hands, and they make the change because they see that they can make this kind of difference. And again, as you said, John, earlier, a lasting, sustainable difference because they're there. And so, it's not just a word of encouragement, it's a plea that the largest professionally trained group of people in the world be the more consistent and steady, arbiters and creators of change. And I think teacher leadership has to take up that mantle.
Thank you for those poignant words. And I thank you again, Fred. Fred is the founder of Teacher Without Borders, and again, in small places. And do go to our show notes. Fred has been very kind to put all kinds of resources. You're listening to this during the summer. You're not at school. You're hopefully relaxing on a beach, or maybe for some starting. And hopefully some of these stories, and I definitely encourage you to read some of the stories. The forklift one is just, to me, the one that really sticks out. And I think it's an important message that more than just, every human is a potential teacher or maybe a teacher. Thank you again, Fred, for your time and your wisdom. And we wish you continued success with the program.
And the best to you both. Thanks. It's been a pleasure.